The day the question landed, Maria was 45, a community organizer in Phoenix who'd spent 2 decades fighting for housing equity. She'd marched, lobbied, written grant proposals at midnight, and cried in parking lots when funding fell through. And then, on a Tuesday morning, she stood in her office staring at a crack in the mirror, a hairline fracture running from corner to corner, probably from the heat, probably been there for months, and thought, is any of this actually working? The initiative she'd poured 3 years into had collapsed. Not dramatically, no scandal, no villain, just a slow deflation of interest from the city council, a shifting of priorities, a new development that promised jobs and conveniently ignored affordable housing units. The community showed up to the meetings. They made their case with data and stories and moral clarity. And it didn't matter. That crack in the mirror felt personal. It split her reflection into 2 versions of herself. The one who believed equality was possible, and the one who was starting to wonder if she'd been naive her whole career. Maybe you've had a moment like that. Not necessarily in community organizing. Maybe in your workplace watching a diversity initiative get watered down until it meant nothing. Maybe in your family, where the division of labor never quite became fair despite all the conversations. Maybe just scrolling through news, seeing the same patterns of injustice decade after decade, and feeling something between exhaustion and betrayal. The question lands differently for everyone, but it lands hard. Is equality real, or are we just telling ourselves a story to keep going? Trapped between 2 camps when that question lands, most of us get pushed toward one of 2 unsatisfying answers. On one side, there are the cynics, people who've looked at the evidence and concluded that equality is a myth. They can point to centuries of failed reforms, to the stubborn persistence of gaps in wealth and health and power, to the way every generation seems to fight the same battles with slightly different language. Their position is coherent. It's also paralyzing. On the other side, there are the naive optimists, people who insist that equality is inevitable if we just believe hard enough. They have the slogans and the vision boards and the passionate social media posts, but they tend to skip over the trade-offs, the unintended consequences, the moments when advancing fairness for one group creates friction with fairness for another. Their position is inspiring. It's also brittle, one setback away from shattering. Here's what nobody tells you. You can be repelled by both camps and still not know where else to stand. You can see the cynic's evidence and feel its weight, and you can see the optimist's hope and want it to be true, and you can end up stuck in the middle, skeptical enough to avoid delusion, hopeful enough to avoid despair, but without a framework that honors both instincts. That middle ground is where this book lives. It's where I've spent most of my adult life, and it's where I've met the most interesting people. People who haven't given up on equality but who refuse to pretend it's simple. Beyond the binary, the problem with the question, is equality a myth or real? Isn't that it's unimportant. It's that it's framed wrong. It assumes equality is a switch, on or off, present or absent, achieved or failed. But that's not how fairness works in actual human societies. Equality isn't a destination you arrive at and photograph for the brochure. It's a direction you move in, a set of practices, an ongoing negotiation between what's ideal and what's possible. Think about any relationship you've been in, romantic, professional, communal. Was it ever perfectly equal? Probably not. But was it meaningfully fair in ways that mattered? Could you point to moments when power balanced better, when voices got heard more evenly, when resources flowed more justly? Probably yes. The difference between perfect equality and no equality is not a void. It's a spectrum, and most of life happens somewhere along it. This book is about learning to see that spectrum, to navigate it without losing your footing, and to act on it without needing guarantees. It's for the skeptical optimist, the person who knows enough history to be wary of utopian promises, but who also knows enough about human dignity to refuse cynicism as a resting place. The 3 dimensions and the threshold. Over the years, working with communities and organizations and just paying attention to my own life, I've come to see that real equality, the kind that holds up under pressure, has to address 3 dimensions simultaneously. Opportunity, who gets access to the starting line. Outcome, what actually happens in people's lives. Dignity, whether people are seen and heard and treated as full humans in the process. Ignore any one of these, and your equality project develops a limp. I've also learned that waiting for perfect equality across all three dimensions is a recipe for doing nothing. What you need instead is a sense of the good enough threshold, the point at which fairness is meaningfully present even if it's not flawless. Universal healthcare doesn't erase all health disparities, but it changes millions of lives. Anti-discrimination laws don't end bigotry, but they create consequences for it and protection against it. Good enough is not a compromise. It's a realistic standard that lets you keep moving. These ideas, the three dimensions, the good enough threshold, will get their full treatment later. For now, just hold them as seeds. They're the beginning of an answer to that question Maria asked in front of her cracked mirror. A field guide, not a manifesto. This book won't give you a grand theory of equality. I'm not interested in writing something that sounds beautiful in a lecture hall and falls apart in a city council meeting or a family dinner. What I want to offer is a field guide, something you can carry into the messy, specific, often discouraging places where equality actually gets built or blocked. We'll start by looking squarely at why doubt is rational. The historical failures, the psychological traps, the structural forces that make equality feel impossible. Then we'll build a framework for understanding what real equality can look like when you strip away the fantasies. After that, it's all practice, a toolkit for small, high-leverage actions you can take wherever you have influence. We'll talk about setbacks and burnout and how to keep going when hope meets hard ground. And finally, we'll explore what happens when equality stops being a project you work on and becomes part of who you are. You don't need to be an activist or a policy expert or a saint to use this book. You just need to be someone who's looked at the world or at your own life and felt that crack in the mirror and decided to keep looking anyway. What you'll carry forward by the time you finish reading, you won't have a simple yes or no to the question of whether equality is real. What you'll have is something better. A way of seeing clearly, acting wisely, and holding hope without needing it to be naive. You'll know how to spot real progress when it's happening and how to push for it when it's not. You'll have language for the trade-offs that scare off the optimists and practices that disarm the cynics. Most of all, you'll have permission to be both skeptical and committed at the same time, to admit that equality is hard, partial, and reversible, and to work for it anyway because that's what dignified people do for each other. The cracked mirror didn't stop reflecting. It just showed a more complicated image. That's where we're headed. Chapter 1: The Mechanics of Doubt. The historical ledger of failures. David sat at his kitchen table, laptop open, coffee cold. He'd been a journalist for 12 years, mostly covering social issues, and he'd just spent 3 hours compiling statistics on wealth gaps. The numbers told a familiar story. Progress in some areas, stagnation in others, backsliding in the worst cases. He closed the screen and stared at the wall. The question that kept surfacing wasn't about policy or data. It was simpler and more uncomfortable. Is any of this actually working? That question has a long history. Look at the civil rights movement in the United States. The 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act were monumental achievements. They dismantled legal segregation. They enfranchised millions. And yet, 50 years later, we still see racial disparities in wealth, housing, education, and criminal justice. Some gaps have narrowed. Others have widened. New forms of exclusion, mass incarceration, predatory lending, emerged from the ruins of the old. The victory was real. The aftermath was complicated. Consider feminism. The right to vote, access to contraception, workplace protections, all hard-won and meaningful. But women still earn less than men for comparable work. They still shoulder disproportionate domestic labor. And the gains have been uneven. White, college-educated women have benefited far more than women of color and working-class women. The movement lifted many boats, but not all, and some were left behind entirely. Economic reforms tell a similar story. The New Deal created a social safety net that dramatically reduced poverty among the elderly. But it also excluded agricultural and domestic workers, disproportionately Black Americans, from key provisions. The intention was to help the vulnerable. The design embedded new inequalities. We look back and see both the genuine achievement and the shadow it cast. This ledger of failure doesn't prove equality is impossible. It proves that progress is uneven, incomplete, and often carries unintended consequences. When we ignore those consequences, we set ourselves up for disillusionment. We expect clean victories and get messy, partial ones. The gap between expectation and reality is where doubt breeds. But there's something else in this ledger too. Each of these movements, despite their flaws, changed lives. They created legal protections that didn't exist before. They shifted cultural norms. They gave people language and frameworks to demand better. The fact that we can see their shortcomings doesn't erase their impact. It just means we need a more honest accounting, one that holds both the gains and the gaps in view at the same time. David eventually opened his laptop again. He didn't find an answer that night, but he started asking a different question. Not is equality real? But what kind of equality have we managed to build, and what's still missing? That shift didn't resolve his doubt, but it made the doubt more useful. It turned a dead end into a starting point. The psychology of the myth-believer doubt isn't just a response to evidence. It's also a habit of mind. The human brain is wired to notice threats, remember losses, and prioritize negative information. Psychologists call this negativity bias. When it comes to equality, that bias has plenty of fuel. Every headline about persistent discrimination, every personal experience of unfairness, every well-meaning initiative that fizzles, they all lodge in memory more firmly than the quiet, incremental gains that happen every day. Confirmation bias compounds the problem. Once we start believing equality is a myth, we unconsciously seek out information that supports that belief. We notice the failures and overlook the successes. We remember the setback and forget the slow, steady progress. The algorithm-driven media environment makes this worse. Outrage and despair drive engagement. Stories of partial progress don't. So the feed keeps serving evidence that the world is fundamentally unjust, and never enough counter-evidence to balance the scales. Then there's the personal dimension. Most people have experienced unfairness firsthand. Maybe you were passed over for a promotion. Maybe you saw a colleague get credit for your work. Maybe you grew up in a community where opportunity felt like a lottery, not a promise. These experiences aren't abstract. They're visceral. They teach a lesson that's hard to unlearn. The game is rigged, and hoping otherwise is naive. I've seen this pattern in people across the political spectrum. The conservative who believes individual merit is all that matters, and then watches connections and inheritance determine outcomes. The progressive who believes systemic change is possible, and then watches a grassroots campaign collapse under infighting and bureaucracy. Both arrive at the same place: cynicism. The details differ, but the emotional logic is the same. There's a strange comfort in that cynicism. Believing equality is a myth protects you from disappointment. If you expect nothing, you can't be let down. It also relieves you of responsibility. If the problem is unsolvable, there's no point in trying. This is the seductive side of doubt. It offers certainty in exchange for hope. And certainty, even grim certainty, feels safer than ambiguity. But that safety has a price. The myth believer's mindset doesn't just interpret the world. It shapes it. When you stop expecting fairness, you stop demanding it. When you stop demanding it, the people who benefit from unfairness have an easier time maintaining the status quo. Doubt becomes not just a way of seeing, but a way of surrendering. Understanding this psychology doesn't make the doubt go away, but it does loosen its grip. When you can recognize negativity bias at work, you can start to question whether your perception matches reality. When you can see confirmation bias steering your attention, you can deliberately seek out evidence of progress, not to be naive but to be accurate. The goal isn't to stop doubting. It's to doubt more precisely. The hidden costs of skepticism. Let's be honest about what skepticism costs. Not the healthy kind, the questioning, probing, truth-seeking skepticism that keeps us from swallowing easy answers. I'm talking about the settled, resigned skepticism that has already made up its mind. This kind of doubt doesn't protect us. It drains us. The first cost is acceptance. When equality feels impossible, we lower our standards. We stop expecting our workplace to address pay gaps. We stop believing our local government will invest equitably in neighborhoods. We stop pushing our schools to serve all children well. These lowered expectations don't feel like a choice. They feel like realism. but they're a quiet form of surrender. And they have real consequences for real people. The second cost is motivation. Action requires some belief that action matters. If you're convinced the system is rigged beyond repair, why would you vote, organize, speak up, or change your own behavior? The connection between belief and behavior is well documented. People who believe change is possible are more likely to work for it. Doubt, left unchecked, becomes paralysis. I once worked with a community group that had spent years fighting for affordable housing in their city. They'd won some victories and lost many battles. Over time, I watched some of the most passionate members withdraw. They didn't stop caring. They stopped believing their care could make a difference. The losses accumulated until hope felt foolish. Their skepticism wasn't wrong. The obstacles were real. But their withdrawal meant one less voice at the table, one less source of pressure on the people in power. The third cost is harder to name but maybe the most important. Skepticism shapes how we see other people. If equality is a myth, then anyone who claims to believe in it is either deluded or lying. This breeds contempt. It erodes the basic trust needed for collective action. You can't build a movement with people you secretly disdain. There's a fourth cost that hits closer to home. Skepticism about equality often becomes skepticism about your own worth. If the world is fundamentally unfair, and you're struggling, it's hard not to internalize that message. Maybe you don't deserve better. Maybe no one does. This isn't a logical conclusion. It's an emotional one. But it seeps in anyway. Naming these costs doesn't mean we should pretend they don't exist or force ourselves to be cheerful. It means we should treat skepticism as something with consequences, not just a neutral intellectual position. The question isn't whether doubt is justified. The question is what doubt is doing to us, and whether it's serving the purposes we think it is. The sneaky ways inequality persists. If inequality were only a matter of bad laws and overt prejudice, it would be easier to fix. Pass the right legislation, punish the worst offenders, and move on. But inequality has survival instincts. It adapts. When one form is defeated, another emerges to take its place. This is why doubt feels so rational. The target keeps moving. Take redlining. In the mid-20th century, the federal government and banks systematically refused to insure mortgages in predominantly black neighborhoods. This was explicit legal discrimination. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 made redlining illegal. But the effects didn't disappear. Generations of families were denied the wealth-building opportunity of homeownership. Today, the average black family has about 1/10 the wealth of the average white family. That gap isn't a result of current discrimination alone. It's an inheritance, a structural residue of policies that ended decades ago. Implicit bias works in subtler ways. Studies show that identical resumes with white-sounding names receive more callbacks than those with black-sounding names. Teachers discipline black students more harshly for the same infractions. Doctors undertreat pain in black patients. None of this requires conscious malice. It operates below the level of awareness in the quick, automatic judgments we all make. And because it's implicit, it's hard to see and harder to regulate. Privilege accumulation is another stealth mechanism. Advantage compounds. A child born into a family with financial stability gets better nutrition, more books in the house, access to enrichment activities, and a quieter space to do homework. These small advantages add up. By the time that child applies for college or a job, they're not just benefiting from their own effort. They're benefiting from a cascade of supports that were never equally distributed. The result looks like merit. It's partly luck dressed in accomplishments clothing. Then there's what sociologists call opportunity hoarding. Parents in affluent neighborhoods fight to preserve advantages for their children. Exclusive school districts, legacy admissions, unpaid internships that only the well-off can afford. These aren't acts of bigotry. They're acts of love for one's own children. But they reinforce inequality just the same. Everyone is playing by the rules, and the rules are designed to maintain the gap. These mechanisms matter because they explain why equality can feel like a myth even when progress is happening. You can pass anti-discrimination laws and still see unequal outcomes. You can change individual hearts and still see structural patterns persist. The problem isn't just in people's intentions. It's embedded in systems, habits, and histories that outlast the people who created them. Recognizing this is discouraging. But it's also clarifying. If inequality persists through these specific channels, housing policy, implicit bias, compounding advantage, opportunity hoarding, then those channels are where we can intervene. The mechanisms that make inequality durable also make it addressable. Not easily, not quickly, but concretely. Doubt becomes less overwhelming when it has a shape and a name. Chapter 2. The Spectrum of Equality. A verb, not a noun. Keisha sat in her office at the community college, staring at the latest enrollment data. The diversity initiative she championed was working. More black and brown students in the applicant pool than ever before. But the math readiness scores were dropping, and the faculty senate wanted answers. Someone from the history department had accused the initiative of lowering standards. Someone from student services had called the old admissions process a white supremacist pipeline. Both statements felt true. Both felt unfair. Keisha needed a way to think about this that wasn't a choice between two bad options. She needed a framework that could hold complexity without collapsing into arguments nobody could win. The first shift she made was tiny but seismic. She stopped treating equality like a noun, a destination, a fixed state, something you either have or don't. She started treating it like a verb. Equality isn't a place you arrive at. It's something you do. You equalize. You reduce disadvantage where you find it. You stop asking, is this place equal? And start asking, what are we doing right now to close the gaps we can see? That question is easier to answer. It invites movement instead of verdicts. Think about how we use the word in daily life. We say equal pay, and we picture a number on a paycheck. But that number is the result of 1,000 decisions: who got called for the interview, who had a mentor 3 years ago, who was allowed to attend the meeting where the big project was assigned, who didn't have to explain their hair. You can't isolate one variable and declare victory. But you can look at the whole chain and ask, what step can we fix today? That's equality as process. It doesn't need a final scorecard to be worthwhile. This distinction matters because it rescues hope from perfectionism. If equality is a noun, every failure is existential. If the gender pay gap persists or if a neighborhood remains segregated, then equality was a lie and we should stop pretending. But if equality is a verb, the same facts tell a different story. They mean the work isn't finished. They mean we have more to do. The gap isn't a verdict on the possibility of fairness. It's evidence that fairness takes effort, and last year's effort wasn't enough. Keisha started hosting conversations with the faculty where she refused to let anyone talk about whether the college was truly equal. She asked different questions. What admissions methods widen access without sacrificing readiness? What support do students need between acceptance and first class? What does it look like to equalize not just access, but the chance to succeed once you're here? The arguments didn't disappear, but they became arguments about next steps instead of arguments about identity. People could disagree without feeling accused. They were solving a problem together, not defending their moral worth. The verb framing also handles a core anxiety that cynics raise. If you can't define equality perfectly, they say, then you don't know what you're working toward and anything you do is arbitrary. But that's only a problem if you need a perfect destination. If you're equalizing, you don't need a definition of perfect equality. You just need to see a gap and care about closing it. The direction matters more than the destination. This isn't settling. Is being honest about how moral progress actually works. Keisha kept a sticky note on her monitor for the rest of the semester. It said, equality is a verb. She didn't have the answer yet, but she had a question that let people move. And that, she realized, was something you could build on. The 3 dimensions of fairness. A few weeks into the debate, a colleague from the economics department stopped by Keisha's office. He was sympathetic to the initiative but frustrated by the language people used. Every time someone says, opportunity, he said, they mean something different. One person means scholarships. Another means mentorship. A third means not getting stopped by campus security for looking suspicious. You can't design a policy when the words don't stay still. Keisha realized he was right. The problem wasn't just disagreement about what to do. It was disagreement about what fairness even means. She needed a clearer map. She eventually settled on 3 dimensions. The first is opportunity: who can get in the door, apply for the job, access the resource. This is the dimension most equality efforts focus on, because it's the most visible and the easiest to measure. You can count applications, acceptances, hires, but opportunity alone is thin. A student can get admitted to college and still fail because they can't afford books, or because nobody taught them how to study, or because they're working 2 jobs and living in their car. Open doors matter. They're just not enough. The second dimension is outcome. What actually happens to people after the door opens? Do they graduate? Do they get promoted? Do they earn enough to stop worrying about rent? Outcome is harder to control, which is why many institutions avoid measuring it. But outcome is where fairness becomes tangible. Keisha liked to point out that nobody tells a marathon runner, "You had equal opportunity to start the race," if they had to run in flip-flops while everyone else wore racing shoes. Outcomes reveal whether the opportunity was real or just ceremonial. The third dimension is harder to count and easiest to dismiss. Dignity. Does the process treat people as full humans? Are their voices heard when decisions affect them? Do they get to participate in defining what fairness means? Or is fairness something handed down by experts and administrators? Dignity is not a luxury. Keisha had watched well-designed policies collapse because the people they were supposed to help felt managed rather than respected. A program can check every opportunity box and still fail if it communicates that the recipients are problems to be solved, not people to be partnered with. These 3 dimensions don't always align. A hiring initiative might offer great opportunity but produce mediocre outcomes if the workplace culture drives people away. A community decision-making process might honor dignity beautifully while producing decisions that reinforce existing inequalities. Keisha learned to ask 3 questions about any proposal. Does it widen access? Does it improve results? Does it treat people as capable and worthy? The most durable solutions addressed at least 2 out of 3. The ones that only addressed 1 tended to generate backlash or burnout. The interaction between dimensions is where the real complexity lives. Keisha discovered that the faculty senate could tolerate conversations about opportunity because it felt neutral and procedural. Conversations about outcome felt more threatening because they implied the institution was failing someone. Conversations about dignity felt the most dangerous because they raised questions of power. Who decides what counts as respect? Whose experience matters? These were not policy questions. They were identity questions, and they had to be navigated with care. What the 3-dimensional view offered wasn't a solution but a diagnostic tool. When a fairness effort stalled, the framework helped locate the problem. Often the problem was that 1 dimension had been ignored. The admissions initiative had strong opportunity design but weak outcome support and almost no dignity component. Fixing that meant adding resources for incoming students and changing how the college communicated with them. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a better one, and better, Keisha was learning, was worth a lot. The good enough threshold. One evening Keisha met her sister for dinner. Her sister was a nurse, not an academic, and she listened to the college drama with the patience of someone who dealt with actual emergencies. When Keisha finished, her sister put down her fork and said, "It sounds like you're trying to figure out how good is good enough." Keisha laughed, but the question stuck. It was exactly the right question. Not how do we achieve perfect equality? Not how do we know we've failed? But how do we know when what we've done is enough to count? The good enough threshold is a concept borrowed from design and engineering. You don't build a bridge to survive every conceivable earthquake. You build it to survive the earthquakes that are likely. You don't wait for a perfect material. You build something that works now with what you have and you plan to maintain it. The same logic applies to equality work. You're not trying to create a perfectly just world. You're trying to reach a threshold where the most damaging inequalities have been addressed, and the remaining ones can be managed through ongoing effort. Keisha started applying this to the college. The admissions process wasn't perfect, but could it reach a threshold where students from all backgrounds had a reasonable shot? Yes. Could the completion rates narrow enough that the gap was no longer a scandal? Probably, with the right supports. Could students feel that their experience was respected, even if the culture wasn't perfect. Yes. The good enough threshold gave the team permission to celebrate progress without pretending the work was over. It was a resting point, not a finish line. Examples help. Universal healthcare doesn't have to provide every possible treatment perfectly and instantly to be good enough. It has to ensure that nobody goes bankrupt from sickness, and that basic care is available to everyone without catastrophic delay. Anti-discrimination laws don't have to eliminate every biased thought from the human brain. They have to make bias costly enough that it recedes from public life and give people harmed by it a route to recourse. Community decision-making doesn't have to make everyone feel heard all the time. It has to shift enough power that the people most affected stop feeling like bystanders to their own lives. The threshold isn't static. It moves. 100 years ago, women's suffrage was the threshold. Today, it's baseline expectations around representation and bodily autonomy. That movement is good. It means the good enough threshold can shift toward more ambitious goals without demanding that we wait for a utopia. Keisha found this liberating. It meant she could ask, is this good enough for now? And also, what would good enough look like in 10 years? Both questions were valid. Neither required pretending the present was perfect. The threshold concept also helps with a practical problem that paralyzes many equality efforts. How do you stop fighting? If equality is a verb and the work is never done, then every activist is condemned to eternal exhaustion. The good enough threshold answers that you stop when the system is functioning well enough that it doesn't need constant heroism to sustain it. You hand off. You rest. You let the maintenance mechanisms do their job, and you reserve your energy for the next push when the threshold shifts. This is not complacency. It's sustainability. Keisha presented the good enough threshold to the faculty senate without using the phrase itself. She said, "We're not trying to solve inequality. We're trying to make this institution better than it was, and good enough that it doesn't actively harm people while we continue to improve." The room was quiet. Then someone said, "That might actually be possible." That was the moment Keisha knew the framework was real. Living with trade-offs of everything Keisha learned during the diversity initiative battle, the hardest lesson was this: fairness values genuinely conflict. They don't just appear to conflict because people are stubborn or bigoted or uninformed. They actually collide. Free speech and protection from hate speech can be in tension. Meritocracy and representation can pull in opposite directions. Individual rights and collective welfare can require trade-offs that nobody wants to make. The student who felt the admissions policy was a racial handout wasn't just being defensive. He was articulating a real tension between two equalizing efforts, rewarding individual effort and correcting historical group disadvantage, that don't fit neatly together. Keisha used to believe that if people just understood the other perspective, the conflict would dissolve. Empathy would bridge the gap. But she watched conversations where everyone understood perfectly and still disagreed. The problem wasn't misunderstanding. The problem was that values are plural. There is no single scale on which all good things can be ranked. You can't maximize free expression and protect vulnerable groups from speech that dehumanizes them, not perfectly, not with the same policy at the same time. Someone has to lose something, and losing something feels like injustice. The mature response to trade-offs isn't to deny them or to declare one side permanently right. It's to negotiate them honestly. Keisha started asking the faculty not which value is more important, but in this specific situation, for these specific people with the resources we have, what trade-off can we live with? This changed the conversation. It stopped being a moral purity contest and became a design problem. Design problems have solutions. Moral purity contests just produce exhausted, resentful people. Some trade-offs are easier than others. When a policy improves opportunity and outcome for most people but slightly reduces dignity for a few, you might accept that and compensate for the dignity loss in other ways. When a policy improves dignity but reduces measured outcomes in the short term, you might tolerate the outcome dip while you build additional supports. The key is to name the trade-off explicitly. Keisha learned that the most damaging conflicts were the ones where people pretended no trade-off existed at all. Those conflicts felt like betrayal. The honest ones felt like negotiation, which is what they were. Trade-offs also shift over time. A community might accept tighter hate speech restrictions in a moment of crisis, then loosen them when the crisis eases. A workplace might prioritize representation in hiring for 5 years, then shift to outcome equity once representation is stable. The good enough threshold applies here too. You don't need the perfect balance for all time. You need a balance that works now, with a plan to revisit it as conditions change. This is not moral relativism. It's the recognition that every real-world decision involves choosing among goods, and the wise choose differently depending on the context. What this means for the everyday practitioner is permission to be imperfect. You don't have to resolve every tension in the universe of fairness. You have to be honest about which tensions you're trading off and why. Keisha started a faculty discussion group where the only rule was that you had to name the trade-off you were proposing. I'm proposing we prioritize opportunity over outcome for the first year. I'm proposing we protect dignity even if it slows measurable results. The conversations got clearer. People disagreed without the weird feeling that the other side was morally broken. They were just negotiating like adults. The cynics in the room didn't disappear, but even some of them leaned in. One professor, a committed skeptic of the initiative, admitted that naming trade-offs made the whole thing feel less like propaganda and more like actual problem-solving. He still didn't agree with everything, but he stopped calling the effort a fraud. That, Keisha thought, was a kind of progress that no metric could capture. Chapter 3. The Pragmatist's Toolkit. The low-hanging fruit audit. When a pipe bursts in your basement, you don't start by redesigning the city's water system. You find the valve and you turn it. Most of us have more influence than we think in areas we've never examined. The low-hanging fruit audit is exactly that. A systematic look at your daily life to find equality gains that are close, cheap, and doable, the places where a small nudge creates an outsized shift. Grab a notebook. Draw 3 columns. Sphere, gap, and lever. Sphere is where you have influence, your team at work, your co-op board, your extended family group chat, the volunteer committee you sit on. Gap is the inequality you notice there. Who gets talked over? Whose time is treated as less valuable? Who never gets asked for input? Lever is the smallest, lowest effort move you could make to close that gap even a fraction. Miriam, a warehouse supervisor I worked with, did this audit in 15 minutes at her kitchen table. Her sphere was her shift crew. Her gap, younger workers, especially women, never got the forklift certification that led to better pay. The senior men hoarded the training slots. Her lever? She added 1 line to the shift change email. Next cert session has 3 spots. Reply if interested. First come, first served. Within 2 months, she had 2 women certified. No policy battle. No confrontation. Just noticing a door and propping it open. The audit works because it bypasses the part of your brain that wants to fix the entire world by dinner. You're not asked to solve structural sexism. You're asked to find one valve you can reach. The shift from "this is impossible" to "this one thing is possible" is not just practical. It rewires your sense of agency. Your brain starts looking for levers everywhere. Be ruthless about ease. If a gap requires a hero's journey to close, skip it for now and find a smaller one. We're building proof, not a monument. The goal of the audit is to generate a list of 4 or 5 tiny moves you can make this month, not a master plan for justice. Smaller than you think. Smaller than that. Consider invisible effort gaps. In many settings, the same people always end up organizing the food, taking notes, cleaning up, tasks that don't lead to influence or promotion. An audit might reveal this pattern in your own meeting room. The lever could be a shared rotation announced in advance, or simply naming the pattern out loud. I notice we've asked Donna to take notes 5 weeks running. Let's switch. These micro-inequalities persist because no one audits them. Once you have your list, pick the easiest one and do it this week. Not plan it. Not research it further. Execute it. The low-hanging fruit audit is worthless if it stays in the notebook. Its purpose is to move you from observation to action in the shortest possible time, creating a small, undeniable fact. You made something fairer. That fact becomes fuel. The art of the imperfect ally conversation. Most equality conversations fail before they start because we approach them with an unspoken demand. Agree with me or you're the problem. That posture loses almost everyone, including the person you might have moved an inch. The imperfect ally conversation is a different approach. You lower the bar from conversion to curiosity. You aim for a tilt, not a flip. The script has 4 moves, and you can use them in any order. Move 1. Lead with a genuine question. How did you come to see it that way? Not, how can you possibly think that? Tone is everything. You need to mean the question. Move 2. Share a specific, concrete example from your own experience. Not a statistic, not a lecture, just a moment where you saw inequality in action and it stuck with you. I remember when my coworker Jamila's ideas kept getting assigned to someone else in meetings. She'd say it, silence. Then Tom would say the same thing and people nodded. Move 3. Name the discomfort without indicting the person. I struggle with this too. I catch myself defaulting to certain voices and ignoring others. It's hard to unlearn. This move is critical because it signals that you're not standing above the problem, you're standing in it with them. People defend themselves when they feel accused. They open up when they feel accompanied. Move 4. Leave the door open for future conversation, not a forced conclusion. I'm still figuring out what to do about it, honestly. I'd be curious what you think if you notice it too. You're not demanding an action plan. You're not extracting a confession. You're inviting someone into a shared noticing. Most people can handle that without armor. I saw this work in a parent-teacher meeting where a father, Greg, insisted that the school's equity initiatives were lowering standards. Another parent, Tanya, didn't argue. She asked him about his own kid's education, what worked, what worried him. Then she described watching her daughter's friend get tracked into lower math because of one test score. She said she didn't have the answer, just that it bugged her. Greg didn't change his mind that night, but he stopped repeating his talking point. A week later, he asked Tanya for the name of the assistant principal she mentioned. Tilts matter. This script is not for extremists. It's for the vast middle, people who are not hostile but are tired, distracted, or defensive. They don't need a debate. They need a doorway. Your job is to stand in it, not shove them through. Avoid the trap of fact-dumping. Data rarely changes minds in these moments because the argument is rarely about facts. It's about identity, belonging, fear of being blamed. Address those undercurrents, and the facts can land later. Lead with the story, not the spreadsheet. Lead with the question, not the verdict. The multiplier effect: some changes are just changes. Others are keys that unlock a dozen doors at once. The multiplier effect is the search for keystone moves, actions in your domain that create cascading equality gains without requiring separate battles for each one. It's the difference between bailing water and plugging the leak. Keystone moves often hide in systems nobody designed deliberately. Take meeting structures. A manager I know, Evelyn, noticed that her team's brainstorming sessions were dominated by the loudest 3 people, always the same 3. She made one change. She required everyone to write their ideas down silently for 5 minutes before discussion began. That was it. The result? Introverts, non-native English speakers, and junior staff all contributed more. Ideas diversified. And the loud 3 didn't complain because they still got to talk. One procedural shift. Multiple equality gains. To find your keystone move, ask a specific question. What is the smallest change I can make that would improve fairness for at least 3 different groups or in 3 different situations? Look for bottlenecks, places where unequal access or voice concentrates. Hiring processes, event scheduling, how information is shared. The bottleneck is the lever because unclogging it benefits everyone downstream. A neighborhood association president named Carlos realized their meetings were held at 7 p.m. on Wednesdays, which excluded anyone with evening shifts, childcare responsibilities, or night classes. He moved 1 meeting per quarter to Saturday morning and added a hybrid video option. Attendance broadened immediately. The voices that entered the room changed the association's priorities, away from flower beds and toward public transit and after-school programs. One scheduling change. A different neighborhood conversation entirely. Keystone moves don't require authority. They require observation. You can be the person who notices that the office's casual networking events are always at a bar, excluding anyone who doesn't drink, can't afford the tab, or has to get home to kids. Suggesting one rotating format is a keystone move. It's not glamorous, but it quietly rewires who feels included and who gets access to the informal information that drives careers. Be wary of the "that's just how we do things" reflex in yourself and others. Every practice was invented by someone. If it creates inequality and you can change it, it's just a bad invention waiting to be improved. The multiplier effect rewards the pragmatist who can see a rule where others see the weather, immutable only until someone names it and proposes an alternative. After you make a keystone move, watch the ripples. Notice who shows up now. Notice whose idea gets funded next. Document it, not to brag, but to remind yourself the next time you feel powerless, that a small adjustment in the right place can do the work of a revolution. The multiplier effect is hope made mechanical. Measuring what matters. If you can't track whether a gap is closing, you're flying blind. But most equality metrics fail because they're too complex to use regularly or too simple to be meaningful. We need a measuring stick that fits in a human hand. Something you can check in a spare 10 minutes that tells you honestly whether your actions are making a dent. I use 4 questions. They don't require a statistics degree. First, is the gap shrinking? This is the bluntest measure. If you're working on a hiring pipeline, are you seeing a wider range of people advancing to interviews? If you're working on household fairness, is the invisible labor distribution getting closer to even? Pick one number you can count. Applications received, tasks swapped, meeting minutes spoken, and watch it over time. A shrinking gap is a signal you're moving in the right direction, even if slowly. Second, are voices included? This is harder to quantify but impossible to fake. After a decision gets made, an event planned, a policy changed, a budget set, ask yourself who was in the room when it happened and who would have said something useful but wasn't there. You can keep a simple tally for a month. Key decisions made, number of distinct voices involved. A rising number suggests the circle is widening. Third, are outcomes fair? Not just processes but results. If your team launches a mentorship program, does the promotion rate change? In your community garden, does the harvest get shared more evenly than before? Outcomes are messy because the world adds noise. Someone gets sick, moves away, changes jobs. But over a year, you should see the distribution of benefits start to look different. If it doesn't, the intervention needs tweaking. Fourth and subtlest. Is resentment falling? My friend Jen, who runs a cooperative kitchen, tracks this by counting how many times per month someone says a version of, "Why do I always have to?" or "Nobody helps with." When his team restructured the cleaning rotation and added a shared credit system, those complaints dropped from weekly to nearly 0. That's a real equality outcome even if it doesn't fit in a spreadsheet. Fairness feels like relief. You don't need all 4 measures for every project. Pick the one that matters most for what you're trying to shift. The key is regularity. Check your measure monthly, not annually. A monthly pulse lets you adjust before you've wasted a year on a tactic that isn't working. It also prevents the perfection paralysis where you collect so much data you never act. Rough and regular beats precise and postponed. Resist the urge to compare your numbers to some impossible ideal. The question is not, is everything equal now? It's, is it better than it was 3 months ago? That's the only comparison that tells you if you're walking forward or in circles. The skeptical optimist measures with patience, knowing that equality is a direction, not a destination, but a direction you can verify with evidence, not just hopes. Chapter 4. When Hope Meets Hard Ground. The anatomy of a setback. Linda stared at the newspaper headline, her coffee going cold in her hand. The housing equity initiative she'd poured 3 years into, the community meetings, the late nights drafting policy, the fragile coalition she'd built between landlords and tenant advocates, had been gutted in a single city council vote. Her colleague Tom shrugged when she showed him the article. Backlash, Linda. Happens every time. You push too far, too fast, and the tide turns. She wanted to scream at him, but some part of her wondered if he was right. The program that was supposed to level the playing field had triggered a wave of resistance from property owners who felt attacked, from neighbors who whispered about those people moving in, from a local newspaper that ran 3 weeks of editorials about government overreach. Equality had felt tangible, almost in reach. Now it felt like crushed glass underfoot. Setbacks in equality work arrive in predictable shapes. Backlash is the most obvious, when a gain for one group is experienced as a loss by another, and the resulting resentment fuels organized opposition. It happened after Reconstruction, when gains for Black Americans triggered the rise of Jim Crow. It happened after early feminist victories, when the Equal Rights Amendment stalled out under a wave of fearmongering about unisex bathrooms and women in combat. Backlash feels personal because it often is. It targets the very people who dared to believe things could change. But it's not just a force of nature. Backlash thrives on a specific logic. The perception that equality is a zero-sum game, that someone else's gain is automatically your loss. When you understand that logic, you can start to counter it without dismissing the fear behind it. Then there's reform fatigue, the slow, creeping exhaustion that sets in when a change is technically in place but nothing seems to shift. The anti-discrimination policy is on the books, but hiring patterns don't budge. The community garden was built, but the same 3 families use it. Reform fatigue whispers that you already did the work, so why does the work keep demanding more? This is the setback that doesn't announce itself with a dramatic vote or a protest. It just settles in like dust on a shelf you keep meaning to clean. People stop showing up to meetings. The energy leaks out. And suddenly, what felt like momentum is just memory. A third form is subtler still, the reverse discrimination claim. When a diversity initiative faces legal challenge from someone who argues it unfairly excluded them. When a scholarship for first-generation students gets labeled as discrimination against wealthier applicants. This setback weaponizes the language of fairness itself, twisting it until you're defending your efforts against the very values you thought you were upholding. It's disorienting. It makes you question whether equality is even a coherent idea, or just a hall of mirrors where every step forward throws a distorted reflection back at you. These setbacks share a common thread. They exploit the gap between intention and impact. You intended to create fairness. The impact was resistance, exhaustion, or legal jeopardy. That gap is where doubt floods in. It's where Tom's cynicism starts to sound like wisdom and your own hope starts to feel naive. But the anatomy of a setback isn't a death sentence. It's diagnostic. Once you can name the shape of what you're up against, backlash, fatigue, the weaponized language of fairness, you can stop treating it like a mysterious catastrophe and start treating it like a pattern you can navigate. The first question isn't, is equality impossible? It's which setback is this, and what does it need from me? Consider what happened to a community health clinic in Albuquerque that tried to equalize access by offering free services regardless of immigration status. Backlash arrived fast. A state legislator introduced a bill to cut funding, local radio hosts accused the clinic of rewarding lawbreakers, and some longtime patients left in protest. The clinic director, a woman named Rosa, could have folded. Instead, she got curious about the anatomy of her setback. She saw the backlash as driven not just by xenophobia but by a zero-sum fear, the worry that those people were taking something away from us. So she shifted her message. She started talking about the clinic's work in terms of public health outcomes for everyone. Lower emergency room costs, fewer contagious diseases, a healthier workforce. She didn't abandon the equality principle. She reframed it in terms the skeptics could hear. The bill died in committee. Naming setbacks won't make them vanish, but it strips them of their power to shock you into paralysis. Backlash is a predictable immune response from a system that senses change. Reform fatigue is the friction that comes with any long-term shift. Reverse discrimination claims are the inevitable counterpressure when power starts to redistribute. Expecting them is not pessimism. It's preparation. The skeptics in your life, including the one in your own head, will always have evidence ready. Your job is to recognize the pattern, steady yourself, and ask the next question. What now? The burnout trap and the hope balance. There's a particular kind of tired that doesn't come from physical work. It's the exhaustion of hoping for something you can't quite hold on to, of fighting for fairness in a world that keeps finding new ways to be unfair. Maya was a public defender who believed deeply in equal justice. She took every case like it was her own family on trial. For 4 years, she worked 60-hour weeks, celebrated the rare wins, grieved the frequent losses, and told herself the fight itself was the point. Then one morning she sat in her car in the courthouse parking lot and couldn't make herself open the door. She wasn't sad exactly. She was empty. The hope she'd been running on had burned through every reserve she had, and there was nothing left. She'd fallen into the burnout trap. She'd tied her hope so tightly to immediate outcomes that when outcomes didn't come, hope collapsed into ash. Burnout among people pursuing equality isn't just about overwork. It's about the specific emotional toll of caring about a goal that can feel endlessly deferred. Every setback, the backlash, the fatigue, the reverse discrimination claim, takes a small withdrawal from your account of hope. Without regular deposits, the account runs dry. And when it runs dry, the cynics start to sound right. Maybe equality is a myth. Maybe all this effort is just tilting at windmills. The burnout trap turns skepticism from a useful tool into a permanent residence. The hope balance isn't about staying optimistic all the time. That's a recipe for denial, and denial is just burnout waiting to happen. Instead, the balance is about knowing where your hope comes from and deliberately recharging it when it dips. For some people, recharge comes from data, the long arc of progress that shows literacy rates rising globally, child mortality falling, rights expanding over centuries even when the daily news looks grim. For others, it comes from community, the people who show up, who remember why the work matters, who can hold your doubt without letting it infect them. For Maya, recharge came from a group of other public defenders who met every month not to talk strategy but to talk survival. They called themselves the Realist Support Network, and the rule was simple. You could say anything in that room, even, "I don't know if any of this matters," and no one would give you a pep talk. A Realist Support Network is not a fan club. It doesn't exist to cheer you on or tell you you're doing great. It exists to hold space for the ambivalence and exhaustion that come with long-term equality work, without letting that ambivalence curdle into cynicism. The people in your network need to be able to hear your doubts and respond not with hollow reassurance but with something steadier. Yeah, this is hard, and we're still here. That steadiness is a deposit in the hope account. Over time, those deposits accumulate, and you can draw on them when setbacks hit. Another deposit comes from adjusting your relationship to outcomes. If your hope depends on winning every battle, you'll lose hope fast, because you won't win every battle. But if your hope is anchored in something larger, a commitment to process, to integrity, to showing up whether or not you see immediate results, then individual losses don't drain the account the same way. As explored earlier, equality is not a final destination but an ongoing practice. That perspective isn't just philosophically sound, it's emotionally protective. You can lose a vote and still be practicing equality. You can face backlash and still be moving the needle, even if it's in increments you can't see yet. Virginia, a community organizer in rural West Virginia, learned this the hard way. She'd spent a year trying to get a county commission to fund a public preschool program, arguing it would level the playing field for low-income kids. The commission said no twice. The backlash was local business owners complaining about tax increases. Virginia was gutted. But her Realist Support Network, a handful of fellow organizers across the state, reminded her that the conversation itself had shifted. Before her campaign, nobody talked about early childhood education in that county. Now it was on the agenda. The needle had moved, even if the vote hadn't. That shift, invisible on a ballot measure, was real. It was a deposit she could draw on later. You build the hope balance the way you build any other kind of balance. By noticing when you're tipping. Pay attention to the early signals. The cynicism that starts to sound comforting. The dread before checking the news. The feeling that one more setback will break something in you. Those are withdrawals. When you feel them, it's time to make deposits. Call someone in your Realist network. Revisit the data on long-term progress. Step back from the immediate fight and reconnect with why you entered it. The goal is not to eliminate doubt. The goal is to keep doubt from becoming the only voice in the room. The good enough pivot at some point. Every equality effort hits a wall. The full vision you had, the policy that would close the gap entirely, the culture shift that would eliminate bias, the funding that would finally make it fair runs into a reality that won't bend. The temptation in that moment is binary. Either push harder and risk shattering against the wall, or give up and tell yourself equality was a fantasy all along. There's a third option. It's the pivot. Not abandoning the mission, but adjusting the expectation. Not settling for nothing, but settling temporarily for good enough. The good enough pivot is not a euphemism for giving in. It's a strategic recalibration. When the women's suffrage movement in the United States faced decades of failure and ridicule, many activists pivoted from demanding a constitutional amendment to winning voting rights state by state. It wasn't the full vision, but it was good enough to build momentum, to prove that women could vote without civilization collapsing, to create a map of states where the movement was winning. That pivot ultimately led to the 19th Amendment. Without it, the wall might have held for another generation. The suffragists didn't abandon the mission. They just accepted that the current approach wasn't getting them through the wall, and they found a different approach that could. The marriage equality movement offers a more recent example. For years, the goal was full federal recognition of same-sex marriage. That wall looked insurmountable through much of the 1990s and early 2000s, when even civil unions were controversial. Advocates pivoted. They fought for domestic partnership benefits, for hospital visitation rights, for piecemeal legal protections that fell far short of marriage but still made concrete differences in people's lives. Each small win built a track record. Each state that adopted civil unions made it harder for opponents to argue that the sky would fall. By the time the Supreme Court ruled on Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015, the good enough pivots had created a landscape where full equality felt not just possible but inevitable. Linda, the housing equity director from the opening of this chapter, made her own good enough pivot after the city council vote gutted her initiative. She'd wanted a comprehensive policy that would protect tenants across the entire city from unfair evictions, create incentives for affordable development, and establish a community oversight board. The council gave her none of that. What she got instead was a pilot program in one neighborhood, with limited funding and a 2-year sunset clause. It was not the victory she'd worked for. It was, as she put it to her team, a crumb. But then her team lead, a young organizer named Jenna, said something that shifted the frame. A crumb is still food. It keeps us alive long enough to get the next meal. Linda pivoted. She poured her energy into making that one neighborhood pilot extraordinary. She documented every success, every family kept in their home, every landlord who found the process fairer than they'd feared. 2 years later, when the sunset clause came up for review, she had data and stories that made expansion hard to oppose. The council voted to extend the program citywide. The good enough pivot hadn't just saved her sanity. It had laid the groundwork for the victory she originally wanted, on a timeline she hadn't anticipated. The pivot requires letting go of something, and that loss is real. You might need to let go of the timeline you'd imagined. The purity of the original vision. The belief that if you just work hard enough, the wall will fall. Those losses deserve to be grieved. But they are not the same as losing the fight. The good enough pivot asks a specific question. What version of this goal can we actually achieve right now? And how can we use that achievement as a stepping stone rather than a consolation prize? It's the difference between retreat and regrouping. Practicing the pivot means getting comfortable with partial wins. It means asking, after a setback, what's the closest thing to our goal that's still achievable? It means treating that partial win not as a failure to achieve the full vision but as a platform for the next attempt. The skeptics will call it settling. Let them. The pragmatist knows that walls rarely fall all at once. They erode crack by crack, until one day the pressure becomes too much and they crumble. The good enough pivot is how you keep applying pressure when the wall looks immovable. Countering the "it's all relative" objection, there's a particular argument that lands like a door slamming shut. You're in a conversation about inequality, maybe with a skeptical colleague or a family member at dinner, and someone says look, inequality has always existed. It's human nature. Some people will always have more than others. Isn't this whole equality thing just tilting at windmills? The "it's all relative" objection is seductive because it sounds like hard-nosed realism. It points to the persistence of hierarchy across cultures and centuries and shrugs. What did you expect? But the argument collapses under its own weight once you examine it closely. It confuses the existence of inequality with the justification for it. The first flaw in the "it's all relative" argument is that it treats inequality as a single, monolithic thing. But there is a profound difference between the inequality that comes from a talented athlete earning more than me because people pay to watch her play, and the inequality that comes from a child born into poverty attending a failing school while a child born into wealth attends one with small classes and new computers. The first is a natural variation in human outcomes. The second is a structural injustice that compounds over generations. Collapsing all inequality into one category is like saying pain has always existed in response to someone seeking treatment for a broken leg. Technically true, practically useless. The second flaw is the assumption that because something has always existed, it must be an immutable feature of human life. This is the naturalistic fallacy dressed up as wisdom. Slavery existed for most of human history. So did child mortality rates above 50%. So did absolute monarchy. The fact that something has been around for a long time tells you nothing about whether it can be reduced, reformed, or eliminated. Human history is a long record of things that always existed until they didn't. The third flaw is subtler. The "it's all relative" argument often smuggles in a definition of equality that no serious person is actually advocating. It imagines equality means everyone having exactly the same amount of everything. The same income, the same house, the same life outcomes. That's a straw man. As earlier chapters have explored, the goal is not identical outcomes but a reduction of unjust disadvantage. A society where your life chances aren't determined by the accident of your birth. When you define equality properly, the "it's all relative" objection loses its target. Nobody is trying to make everyone identical. They're trying to make the starting line less crooked. There's also an economic counterpoint worth making. Inequality isn't just unfair. In many cases, it's inefficient. When talented kids can't access education because of their zip code, the whole economy loses their potential contributions. When workers are excluded from opportunities because of discrimination, productivity suffers. The International Monetary Fund has published research showing that extreme income inequality can actually slow economic growth. So even if you don't care about fairness on principle, you might care about it on pragmatic grounds. Reducing some forms of inequality isn't just the right thing to do. It's the smart thing to do for everyone. But here's what's tricky. The "it's all relative" objection isn't always coming from a place of bad faith. Sometimes it's an expression of genuine fatigue, of someone who has watched equality efforts stumble repeatedly and drawn a conclusion that feels rational to them. Responding with a lecture won't help. Responding with curiosity might. Ask, when you say it's always been this way, what examples are you thinking of? Or, is there a version of equality you could get behind? Often, the objection masks a real concern. Fear of losing something, frustration with ineffective programs, exhaustion at the scale of the problem, that can be engaged with directly once it's named. A physician named Daniel used this approach with his brother-in-law, a small business owner who kept insisting at family gatherings that equality was impossible because life's not fair, never has been. Instead of arguing, Daniel asked him what fairness would look like in his own business. The brother-in-law talked about wanting employees to have real opportunities to advance, about hating the feeling when a qualified worker got stuck in a dead-end job. Daniel listened and then said, "That's what I'm talking about too. Not making everyone the same. Just making sure people don't get stuck." The conversation shifted. The brother-in-law didn't become an activist. But he stopped reaching for the "it's all relative" door slam. He started asking questions instead. The "it's all relative" objection will never go away entirely. It's too psychologically useful, a way to let ourselves off the hook, a permission slip to stop caring about a problem that feels overwhelming. But you don't need to defeat it in every conversation. You just need to stop letting it end the conversation. When someone says equality is impossible because the world has always been unfair, you can say, the world has always been a lot of things. It's also always been changed by people who didn't accept that as an answer. That's not a knockout blow. It's a door held open. And sometimes that's enough. Chapter 5. Living the Question. The small acts that redefine you. Alex noticed it on a Tuesday. A student, let's call him Marcus, had his head down on the desk again. The old instinct kicked in. Send him to the office, mark the disruption, move on. But something had shifted. Alex walked over, crouched beside the desk, and asked quietly, "What do you need right now?" It wasn't a script from a training. It wasn't a policy. It was a tiny choice, made in a moment, that treated a ninth grader's exhaustion as something to understand rather than punish. That choice, repeated over weeks and months, did more than change Marcus's trajectory. It changed how Alex saw themselves. We tend to think identity is the thing that drives action. First I become a certain kind of person, then I act accordingly. The research on habit formation and self-perception tells a different story. Repeated actions reshape identity from the outside in. You don't wait to feel like a runner before you start running. You run awkwardly and inconsistently, and eventually the identity catches up. Equality works the same way. You don't wait until you feel like someone who embodies fairness. You take a small, concrete action. Ask a question instead of assuming, share credit instead of hoarding it, listen to the quieter voice in the room, and the action writes the identity. This is both liberating and terrifying. It means you don't need a grand conversion experience or a complete personality overhaul to become someone who practices equality. You just need to act today in a way that tilts the ground a little flatter. But it also means there's no off-ramp. Identity, once built through action, demands consistency. If you stop the small acts, the identity starts to fray. Alex learned this the hard way when a stressful week led to snapping at a student in the old dismissive tone. The guilt wasn't about breaking a rule. It was about betraying the person Alex was becoming. The shift from external performance to internal identity is subtle. At first, you're doing the thing because you read a book or attended a workshop or promised yourself you'd be better. You're checking boxes. Then something strange happens. The box checking becomes less necessary, not because you stop doing the actions, but because the actions stop feeling like obligations. They feel like reflexes. When a colleague interrupts a woman in a meeting, you notice the interruption before you decide to say something. The noticing is the identity. The saying something is just the follow-through. This doesn't mean you become a perfect equality machine. Perfection isn't the point. The point is that the gap between who you say you want to be and what you actually do shrinks. Most of us carry a wide, painful gap. We believe in fairness. We hate injustice. But our daily lives are full of small complicity and missed moments. The identity shift happens when the hours spent in that gap start to decrease. You stop telling yourself stories about the great egalitarian you'll become someday and start noticing the dozens of tiny chances you have, every single day, to practice. One of those chances is what you do with your attention. Who do you listen to? Whose ideas do you build on? Whose contributions do you remember and repeat? Attention is a resource you distribute every moment, and most of us distribute it unequally without thinking. The identity shift includes a new kind of attention, an attention to attention itself. You start noticing when you've heard from everyone in the room. You start noticing whose names you cite when you recap a project's success. These aren't heroic acts. They're barely visible, but they're the raw material identity is made of. The world will not reward you for this. That's important to say. You will not get a medal for crouching beside a desk or remembering to credit a junior colleague. The old systems that benefit from inequality will not applaud your quiet resistance. This is why external motivation fails and internal identity endures. If you're doing the small acts to be seen doing them, you'll stop when the audience leaves. But if the acts have become part of who you are, you'll keep doing them in empty rooms, in thankless meetings, in moments when no one is watching. That's the threshold. That's when equality moves from a hope you hold to a life you live. The ripple effect in relationships. Tanya didn't set out to change her marriage. She set out to change the way her team handled project assignments, after noticing the same two people always got the visible, career-boosting work. She implemented a simple rotation system. It was awkward at first. People grumbled about losing their clients. But within months, 3 junior team members had developed skills they'd been denied for years. Tanya felt good about it. What she didn't expect was the conversation she had with her husband 2 weeks later, when he automatically assumed she'd handle the school pickup schedule changes again. "Wait," she said. "Why is that default mine?" The question came out differently than it would have a year ago, less accusatory, more curious, more structural. The ripple effect is real. and it works through a mechanism psychologists call cognitive consistency. When you start practicing equality in one domain of your life, the mismatch between that practice and inequality in another domain becomes uncomfortable. Your brain doesn't like the inconsistency, so one of two things happens. You either rationalize the inequality elsewhere, or you start applying the same lens everywhere. Most people, once they've tasted the identity shift, find compartmentalization increasingly difficult. The new way of seeing leaks. This leaks into parenting in ways that are both beautiful and exhausting. You catch yourself interrupting your daughter less than you interrupt your son. You notice when you've assigned chores along gendered lines that don't reflect anyone's actual preferences. You start asking at the dinner table, "Who hasn't spoken yet?" and meaning it. Your kids notice. They may not thank you. They may roll their eyes at the new, annoyingly fair version of their parent. But they're watching. They're learning that fairness isn't a lecture. It's a practice, imperfect and daily, that shapes the air a family breathes. Friendships shift too. The old dynamic where one person always hosts, always initiates, always provides emotional support while the other receives, that dynamic becomes harder to sustain. Not because you become transactional or scorekeeping, but because you start valuing reciprocity as a form of dignity. You notice the friend who never asks how you're doing. You don't necessarily end the friendship, but you might stop overfunctioning, stop filling the silences, stop doing the emotional labor of two people. And sometimes the friendship survives that change and deepens. Sometimes it doesn't. The point is that you're no longer willing to carry inequality in relationships just to keep the peace. The hardest ripple is with people who knew you before. Your family of origin, your oldest friends, the colleagues who remember the version of you who laughed at certain jokes or stayed silent at certain moments. When you change, it can feel like an accusation to them. If what you're doing now is right, then what they're still doing might be wrong. That's uncomfortable. Some people respond defensively. Some distance themselves. Some surprise you by changing too slowly, inspired not by argument but by the quiet consistency of your new way of being. You don't control which response you get. You only control whether you keep showing up as the person you're becoming. There's a particular loneliness in this ripple effect that nobody talks about. When you start practicing equality in your closest relationships, you sometimes lose the easy camaraderie of shared blindness. You can't unsee the dynamics you now see. A family dinner where women clear the table while men stay seated feels different once you've noticed it. You can choose to say something or not, but you can't choose to not notice. And the noticing itself creates a distance from the people who don't notice, from the version of yourself who didn't either. This isn't a reason to stop. It's just a cost worth acknowledging. The identity shift includes learning to bear that loneliness without letting it curdle into resentment or self-righteousness. What sustains relationships through this shift is something counterintuitive: humility. Not the performative kind, but the genuine recognition that you were once the person who didn't notice. You were once the person who interrupted, who took credit, who assumed. That memory can soften your approach. Instead of confronting a partner or a friend with moral superiority, you can say, "I used to do this too, and I'm trying to change it. Can we work on this together?" The invitation to mutuality is more powerful than the demand for change. It respects their dignity while holding the line on yours. That balance, firm on the issue, soft on the person, is the hardest and most important skill the identity shift teaches. The everyday hero's journey. Cecilia didn't plan to redesign her company's hiring process. She was a mid-level manager at a logistics firm, responsible for a team of 12, and she was tired. Tired of seeing the same kinds of resumes rise to the top. Tired of culture fit, meaning people like us. So she did one thing. She removed names from the first round of resume reviews. That's it. No task force, no announcement, no permission. She just started doing it. 6 months later, her team was more diverse than any other in the company. Word spread. Other managers asked how. Cecilia became, without intending to, the hiring equity person. She still rolls her eyes at the title. "I just stopped looking at names," she says. Anyone can do that. The everyday hero's journey doesn't look like the movies. There's no swelling soundtrack. Nobody gives a speech. The work is mundane, incremental and often invisible. A teacher who notices which students never raise their hands and finds other ways to check their understanding. A neighbor who starts a community garden on an abandoned lot and makes sure the plots are assigned by lottery, not by who knows whom. A nurse who realizes the discharge instructions are only in English and starts translating them, one language at a time on her own time. These are not revolutionaries. They're not seeking recognition. They're just people who noticed a small unfairness and refused to look away. What these stories have in common is a starting point. Every everyday hero begins with a specific, local, manageable inequality. Not world hunger or systemic racism. Those are too big to hold. But the way team meetings silence the introverts is small enough to grip. The way the park across town gets better maintenance than ours is specific enough to investigate. The key is to stop scanning the horizon for the great injustice you'll someday vanquish and start looking at the 3 feet around you. What's unfair here, in this room, in this process, in this relationship? That's the dragon. That's the quest. There's a moment in every everyday hero's journey that feels like failure. Cecilia's blind resume reviews worked for a while, but then a new problem emerged. Diverse candidates were getting hired but leaving within a year. The culture they entered wasn't ready for them. Cecilia's small fix had revealed a larger crack. This is the pattern. You solve one piece of the puzzle and discover 3 more pieces you hadn't seen. The temptation is to despair, to think your small act was pointless, that the system is too big. But the everyday hero learns to see this as progress, not failure. The fact that you can now see the next layer of the problem means you've moved close enough to see clearly. You're in the work now. Another thing these stories share: none of the heroes waited for authority. Cecilia didn't ask HR. The teacher didn't wait for a new curriculum. The neighbor didn't petition the city for permission. They operated within their sphere of influence, however small, and they acted. This isn't about breaking rules. It's about recognizing that most of the inequality around us persists not because of formal policies, but because of informal habits that no one has bothered to change. Changing a habit doesn't require a title. It requires attention and a willingness to try something different, even if it's awkward, even if people push back. The pushback is real. People like the old way because it's comfortable. Cecilia's colleagues complained that blind reviews took longer. The teacher's colleagues said the quiet students just needed to speak up. The neighbor got suspicious looks from city officials who wondered what the catch was. The everyday hero learns to expect pushback without being defined by it. They don't become martyrs. They don't burn out in a blaze of righteous fury. They absorb the friction, adjust their approach if needed, and keep going. The persistence is the heroism. Not the dramatic victory, but the quiet refusal to give up. What sustains these heroes over years and decades is something simple. They've seen enough small wins to trust the process. They've watched a quiet student become a confident contributor, a new hire thrive in a culture that previously would have excluded them, a vacant lot become a gathering place for neighbors who now know each other's names. These wins don't make headlines, but they add up in a life to something that looks a lot like hope. Not the naive hope that everything will turn out fine, but the grounded hope that comes from having made a few things turn out a little finer, with your own hands in your own corner of the world. The long view Rosa is 74. She's been doing this work, whatever you want to call it, equality work, fairness work, justice work, since she was 19 and sat in the back of a segregated bus in a city she no longer lives in. She's seen laws change and stay the same. She's seen progress and backlash, hope and exhaustion, generations rise up and burn out. I asked her once what keeps her going. She laughed. "What's the alternative?" she said. "Giving up? That's boring." Then she got serious. "You don't do this work to finish it. You do it because it's yours to do. That's different." The long view is not a strategy. It's a posture. It's the recognition that equality is not a project with a deadline but a practice with no end. This can sound like defeat, but it's actually liberation. When you stop expecting to win in the final, complete, once-and-for-all sense, you can start appreciating the wins you actually get. You can celebrate the small shifts without needing them to signal the arrival of utopia. You can mourn the setbacks without concluding that the whole effort was futile. The long view makes you harder to discourage, because you've stopped tying your hope to ultimate outcomes. This is the skeptical optimist's deepest skill, the ability to hold two truths at once. The truth that equality is real, you've seen it, tasted it, built some of it with your own hands, and the truth that equality is never finished, never secure, always under threat. These truths are not contradictory. They're complementary. The reality is what you build today. The threat is what you'll have to defend tomorrow. Both are true. Both require your attention. The skeptical optimist doesn't choose between them. They live in the tension. Over decades, this tension shapes a particular kind of person. Someone who is hard to manipulate with false promises and hard to defeat with bad news. Someone whose commitment isn't dependent on mood or morale. The long-view practitioner develops a kind of emotional shock absorption. A setback at work doesn't spiral into existential despair because it's one data point in a pattern you've been watching for 20 years. A political defeat doesn't feel like the end of the world because you remember other defeats that were followed, eventually, by unexpected gains. Memory becomes a resource. History becomes a companion. You're not alone. You're part of a long line of people who kept going. There's a phrase Rosa uses that I've stolen. Planting trees you'll never sit under. That's the long view in 5 words. Most of the equality we enjoy today was built by people who didn't live to see the harvest. The civil rights marchers who were beaten and jailed. The suffragists who died before the 19th Amendment. The labor organizers who fought for weekends and safety regulations and never got to take a Saturday off in peace. They planted trees. We sit in the shade. Our job is to plant the next generation of trees, for people we'll never meet, in a world we can barely imagine. This perspective changes how you measure a life. The culture around us measures success in achievements, acquisitions, legacies that bear our name. The long view suggests a different metric. Did you leave the ground a little flatter than you found it? Did you make one structure a little fairer, one process a little more inclusive, one person's burden a little lighter? Those questions have no answer that can be summarized in a resume or an obituary. But they're the questions that matter when you're sitting at 74, looking back at a life spent in the work, and feeling not triumph but something quieter. Satisfaction. The satisfaction of having been, however imperfectly, however incompletely, a force for fairness in an unfair world. The reward of the long view is not victory. It's companionship. You join a community of people, living and dead, who refuse to give up. You become part of a story that's bigger than your story, a current that's been flowing for centuries and will keep flowing after you're gone. The skeptical optimist, at the end of a life of small acts, knows this. Equality is a myth if by myth you mean a perfect, finished state. But equality is real if by real you mean a practice, a direction, a verb. You get to decide every day which definition you live by. Choose the one that keeps you moving. Choose the one that makes you plant trees. Conclusion. The map is not the territory. The journey so far. You started this book with a question that probably felt too big to answer. Is equality a myth, or is it real? Maybe you leaned toward one side, exhausted by empty promises or irritated by relentless cynicism. Maybe you floated somewhere in between, unsure where to land. That question brought you here, not to a tidy resolution, but to something more useful. A way of seeing that holds both doubt and possibility without letting either one win. We traced the roots of skepticism honestly. The failed projects, the stubborn gaps, the psychological habits that make equality feel like a fairy tale. You saw that doubt isn't a character flaw, it's a reasonable response to real history and lived experience. But you also saw the cost of letting that doubt calcify into resignation. Accepting inequality as inevitable doesn't protect you from disappointment. It just guarantees you'll never be part of the solution. Then came the shift. Instead of asking whether equality exists, we started asking what kind of equality is worth building. The spectrum gave you a language for the messiness. Opportunity, outcome, dignity. These aren't competing ideals to pick between. They're dimensions that need each other. You learn to recognize progress that's real even when it's incomplete, and to name the trade-offs without using them as excuses to quit. The toolkit put that understanding into your hands. You practiced spotting the small, high-leverage moves that most people overlook. You rehearsed the imperfect ally conversation, not a script for winning arguments, but a way to stay in the room with people who disagree. You built a measurement framework simple enough to use on a Tuesday afternoon. These aren't theories. They're habits waiting to be activated. When the ground got hard, you saw that setbacks aren't failures, they're data. Backlash, burnout, the creeping whisper that says, "Why bother?" These aren't signs you're wrong about equality. They're signs you're close enough to the problem to feel its friction. You learned the pivot. Adjust expectations without abandoning the mission. You learned to build a network that sustains hope without requiring you to fake it. And finally, you glimpsed the identity shift. Not a dramatic transformation, but a quiet realignment. The difference between someone who hopes for equality and someone who practices it. The teacher who stopped thinking about reducing disparities and started thinking, "This is just how I do my job." The manager who stopped performing fairness and started embodying it. The neighbor who stopped waiting for permission. What the map cannot show you, here's what this book didn't give you. A perfect blueprint. No 10-step plan guarantees equality will bloom wherever you plant it. No framework eliminates the risk that your efforts will be misunderstood, under-resourced, or rolled back. If you were waiting for the final chapter to reveal the airtight argument that converts every skeptic, this is the moment to let that expectation go. The map is not the territory. Every concept in these pages, the spectrum, the threshold, the pivot, the identity shift, is a sketch of reality, not reality itself. Real equality work is lumpy. It happens in conversations that go sideways, in policies that help some people and frustrate others, in the long pause between asking for change and seeing it arrive. The map helps you navigate, but it can't walk for you. This isn't a shortcoming of the book. It's the nature of any guide that tries to describe something alive. A map of a forest shows you trails and elevations, but it doesn't capture the smell of pine or the sound of birds, or the way the light shifts at dusk. Equality is like that. You can study its dimensions, audit your sphere of influence, and practice the imperfect ally conversation, but eventually you have to step into the actual awkwardness of doing the thing. And that awkwardness is where the proof lives. The question that opened this book, myth or real, can't be answered on the page. It can only be answered by what happens when you act. March on a Saturday. Revise the hiring rubric on a Monday. Ask a neighbor what fairness would look like in your building. The answer emerges not from thinking about equality, but from doing it, watching what unfolds and adjusting as you go. Some of what you try will flop. That's built into the design. The good enough threshold isn't a finish line. It's a moving target that teaches you something every time you miss it. The question isn't whether you'll get it right on the first attempt. The question is whether you'll keep attempting while staying honest about what's working and what isn't. The map gave you landmarks. The territory will give you stories you couldn't have predicted. Trust both. The daily yes. So what does living the question actually look like tomorrow morning? It looks smaller than you think. It looks like pausing before a decision and asking yourself, who's not in this room, and would they recognize their concerns in the outcome? It looks like noticing when you've defaulted to a story about what certain people are like and catching yourself mid-sentence. It looks like choosing to share credit, to ask a different question, to sit with discomfort long enough to learn what it's teaching you. None of this requires you to believe equality is inevitable. You don't need to paper over the evidence that some gaps are widening or that certain institutions resist change with astonishing creativity. The skeptic in you can remain fully employed. Its job is to keep you honest, to flag the potholes, to question whether your latest tactic is actually moving the needle or just making you feel noble. The skeptic is not your enemy. It's your quality control. And the optimist? Its job is to keep you moving, not with blind faith, but with the stubborn conviction that fairness is worth attempting even when the odds are unclear. The optimist notices the teacher whose classroom actually got calmer, the team that genuinely diversified its pipeline, the block that built a mutual aid network that outlasted the crisis. These are data points, not delusions. They don't prove equality is easy. They prove it's possible. Holding both skeptic and optimist is not a contradiction you need to resolve. It's a tension you learn to inhabit. Some days the skeptic drives and you spend your energy questioning assumptions and demanding better evidence. Other days the optimist takes the wheel and you pour yourself into a project that might fail but deserves your full heart anyway. The balance is dynamic, not static. This is what it means to choose equality daily, imperfectly, together. The together part matters more than most of us admit. You won't sustain this alone. You need people who will tell you the truth when your project is drifting, celebrate with you when something small clicks, and remind you what you're actually trying to do when you forget. Find them. Be one of them for someone else. That's the realist support network in action, not a formal club, but a web of people committed to fairness without pretense. One small act. I'm going to ask you for something concrete, and I want you to treat it seriously. Before you close this book, pick one small, specific, achievable act of fairness. Not a grand gesture. Not a resolution to be more equitable. Something you can do by the end of the week that would make one situation slightly fairer than it is right now. Could be as simple as looking at the next meeting agenda and noticing who always speaks first. It could be pulling aside a junior colleague and asking what barrier they keep running into that no one's addressed. It could be researching one policy in your organization, hiring, promotion, scheduling, and flagging a change that would disproportionately help people who are currently on the margins. It could be writing a letter to a local official about a zoning decision that affects whose kids get to play in which parks. The act itself isn't the point. The point is to break the spell that says equality is somewhere else, handled by someone else, too complex for someone like you to touch. That spell is powerful. Keeps kind people passive. It turns legitimate skepticism into an alibi for inaction. The only way to break it is to do something, however small, and then pay attention to what happens next. After you act, watch. Did the gap shrink even a little? Did someone who usually stays quiet say something? Did you learn something about the system you're operating in that you didn't know before? The measurement framework from earlier in our journey isn't a test you pass or fail. It's a feedback loop. Small acts produce small data, and small data accumulated over time gives you a picture of what's actually working. You might discover that your act had no visible effect. That's data too. Maybe the barrier is structural, not interpersonal. Maybe the person you were trying to help doesn't experience the problem the way you assumed. Maybe the system is designed to absorb individual acts of fairness without changing. Learning this isn't failure. It's calibration. Adjust the act, try something adjacent, ask a different question. The loop continues. The book ends here, but the experiment doesn't. You now have a map. You have tools. You have permission to be skeptical and optimistic in the same breath. What you don't have is a guarantee. But you never needed one. You just needed to start.